All right, Aiden. My name is Dr. Andy Brown, and I'm here with the ten big questions. I'd like to begin. I find what Aiden is doing and where she's doing it as being fascinating. And so I'm going to start with kind of off-script questions, and actually ask Aiden about where she's currently located and what got her to what got her to her current place.
Yeah. So I'm Aiden. I am one of the PhD students in the Counselor Education and Supervision program, and I am currently located in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. I actually was living in Iowa City, Iowa before this and practicing as a crisis counselor there, but my partner got an opportunity to come over here. Originally, I wasn't going to join him, and then I thought, why not? I was at a great place in my career where I could go remote. There was an opportunity for me to continue school while being overseas and not have to pause my PhD program. And then one of the really cool things that I'm getting to do now that I'm here is the visa that I'm under. It's called the Dutch American Friendship Treaty visa. And essentially, the Dutch government gives priority to Americans who open up businesses within the Netherlands. And I'm opening my own counseling practice here. So it works out well that I can continue to practice as a counselor. I get this chance to open a private practice and start that venture. But at the same time, I get to have a visa and explore a brand new country.
Yeah, Aiden, thank you. And I have so much respect for you. I can't tell you how many times I've daydreamed about running away. And I'm gonna just move overseas and that kind of thing. Very few people have the guts to actually do that. And so my hat's off to you. And you mentioned coming from Iowa and now you're in Amsterdam. And one of the things that we really speak to here is culture. And I'm super curious about the cultural shift and differences that you saw in between Iowa and Amsterdam. How have you kind of assimilated into Amsterdam? What's that been like for you?
I've absolutely loved it here. And it is a big culture shock. I mean, obviously, Amsterdam is a huge city with millions of people versus, I was in a decently sized city in Iowa, but it's still Iowa. It's not exactly a huge place. Um, but I think too, like there's very subtle cultural differences. So, for example, the work-life balance here is just so radically different than it is in the United States. There was very much in the US the sense of like you work as many hours as you need to and you put in the hard work and you kind of give your life to your career. Um, and that's not the case over here. Very much people take it as like your job is your job. You should have a passion for what you do, but it's not everything in your life. Um, and it's interesting how that plays out. So, for example, it's really hard to find a 24-hour convenience store here because like people want to have a good work-life balance. So very few people are willing to work the overnight shifts at places. Um, and so a lot of stores are just open, the 9 to 5, 9 to 6. And then because of that, employers are super understanding if you're like, yeah, I'm going to take an extra long lunch because I need to go run errands and the store is going to be closed by the time work's over. Um, so it's really kind of changed the way that people live in really subtle ways that I think is cool to see from a different perspective.
Yeah, thank you. One of the things that we talk about here and the 10 questions that we're doing, we talk about, bravery and whatnot, and what it takes to do, like what you're doing. And I'm super curious about um, what you would what you would share with another person or clinician that wanted to relocate to a place that basically was into a completely different maybe country or culture than they currently lived in. What advice might you give?
I mean, the obvious advice would be, yes, go for it. I think one of the things that really helped me with this move, and maybe with some other radical moves that I've done in the past, because I have moved around to different places, is just this idea of, you're not stuck there. It's not a permanent choice. So even though I love it here in Amsterdam, like I fully intend to go back to the States at some point. I don't know when yet, but I think when you realize that the choice that you're making is for right now, it's serving its purpose right now, it's doing me good right now, but I can always change my mind. I can always backtrack. I can always move somewhere completely different. It makes it much easier to make that choice. And then I think just being honest with yourself about what you want. You know, it, for me, it was really important that I get a chance to experience a different country and experience a different culture. And I recognize that, like, after I finish this PhD program, I'm really going to be moving forward in my career where I'm going to be working for a university. So I may not have the freedom to move around like I do right now. So I was kind of like, all right, this is the time to do it. Let's take the plunge.
You mentioned, you talk a little bit about freedoms and, opportunities. Going there, certainly a great opportunity. You also said, hey, if I don't want to be here, I can move or whatever. Would you speak to the role of privilege in your choices?
Oh yeah, I mean that's a huge part of it. I mean, even in terms of the privilege of where I work, the nonprofit that I've been working for the last 3 years was just so gracious to be like, yeah, we'll make a remote position for you, which they didn't have to do. Um, but that gave me the financial freedom and the opportunity to make this move where I wouldn't have been able to do that if I had been on my own. I think also, again, the privilege of having a PhD program where it is online and I can, you know, jump on a ship and head to the other side of the world and continue to do it. Um, but too, also being in a place of financial security, social supports with my partner and my friends. Um, I think sort of a security in terms of job and career skills, and that, even if um, my current workplace hadn't been able to work something out, I am a highly skilled clinician, and so I have the ability to open a private practice and make money for myself. And so there is a huge amount of privilege that plays into making a move like this.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate your honesty and sharing that and being vulnerable. A question, super curious to when we talk about creating safe places for clients when we're dealing with challenging topics, could you kind of contrast the difference in maybe how you create maybe a safe place for someone in Iowa versus where you are now and the culture that you're currently living in?
Ah, that's a good. I think part of something I have to recognize where I am now. So Amsterdam, the city itself, 30 to 40% of the people living in Amsterdam are immigrants. They're not Dutch. I mean, myself included. And I think I've become really aware, having moved here, of what the immigrant experience is like, but also how privileged my experience has been. And that I've moved to a country where people look like me. The vast majority of people speak English, as well as Dutch. There's a lot of understanding for immigrants. But I think that's really opened up my eyes to ways that I can be a better clinician to folks that are immigrants or non-native to the places that they're living and working in.
Mhm.
And that was something that I didn't really experience much in Iowa because we just did not have that diversity.
Right.
Um, I mean, there certainly are immigrants living in Iowa, but it's a pretty homogeneous kind of state.
Sure.
So I think I've had to make some shifts in how do I approach things now that I live here.
Okay. Thank you very much. Again, super fascinating. Great ecumenical view. You know, when you think about taking off the blinders and being able to see a larger world, and it must be amazing to be able to take that experience with you whenever you do, should you choose to leave, and how enriching that might be as a therapist wherever you go.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, how do you express yourself creatively? Creatively. First day with these new lips.
Um, I surprisingly have been adapting like art and other creative uh, outlets into my self-care more and more recently. I don't really consider myself an artistic person or an artist or anything like that, but I've found that I'm doing a lot of drawing as part of self-care, um, just to get a chance to like focus on something other than my brain for a bit. Um, so I've invested in some sketchbooks and things like that. Um, I am also a huge nerd. I play Dungeons and Dragons regularly, at least a couple of times a week. And so that creativity of, role playing with friends, or we do a lot of sort of writing exercises where you're writing your character's perspective on things. That's been a huge, sort of self-care for me, a little bit of distraction from school and from work. Um, Although it's also kind of interesting because a lot of the perspective taking that we talk about in counseling, I do with my characters too. Of like, ooh, I wonder, given that, this character's backstory and some of the trauma that she's faced, how would she react to this? And it's funny how that ends up interacting.
Yeah. It feels like sometimes as you become a therapist, it's hard to know where the counselor stops and the person starts anymore. It just becomes intertwined in who you are as a person, certainly.
Yeah.
Um, what's what's disturbed you the most over the last 3 years?
Ooh. um, the most. I think just the I think the examples of hatred. Um, I mean, in things from, the murder of George Floyd to reactions to that, to the way that politics in the United States have gotten nasty. Um, I mean, there's always going to be disagreements and different points of view. And I think there's a huge amount of strength in people having different points of view, and learning from one another. But there's we've moved beyond that ability to have discussions with one another and explore those differences. And it's turned into just this like, I hate this other group of people. Um, and I think I don't know if it's gotten worse as I've gotten older, if I've just become more aware of it as I've gotten older. Um, but that was really, really disturbing to me. And it was really interesting moving here because I'm obviously very aware of American politics and some of the things that are going on in our country. Um, but when I was living in America, I mean, I heard nothing about Dutch politics. I didn't even know that the Netherlands had a king until I moved here. Um, but it turns out that there's some of the same discussions going on here I mentioned immigration. There's also a lot of xenophobia here. And so it's disheartening to see that seems to be kind of an experience that transcends different countries too.
Yeah. Thank you very much. What's the hardest part of your job?
So I, in particular, work in crisis counseling. That's my niche. I love it. Even though I am opening a private practice, I will never give up crisis counseling. That's my thing. But a really tough part of crisis counseling is that for the most part, I'm usually working with that client just in that moment of time. I do have some clients that I work with repeatedly because life circumstances put them in crisis a lot. But there's also a lot of clients where I talk to them for an hour, 2 hours, work with them through that crisis, and then I never see them again.
Mm.
And that can be really tough because there's the what if. You get really professionally invested in the person and you want to make sure that they're doing well and they get the supports that they need and they feel affirmed and respected. And try to give all of that to them in that crisis counseling session, but you never really know, okay, what happened after? Were they physically safe? Were they psychologically safe? Did they end up in the hospital? And that can be kind of tough.
Thank you for being vulnerable again. Um, what is the last book you read?
Oh, actually, do I have it? Yes, I do. I just finished Voices from Chernobyl. Of course, my screen wants to blur it out.
Right.
It is a collection of narrative histories of people who were living near the Chernobyl nuclear plant when it had the critical meltdown. I loved it. I mean, obviously, it's really distressing to hear how these people's lives were changed, but I loved being able to hear people's perspectives and their narratives. And just, yeah, the way this one event impacted so many people.
Super interesting. And thank you for sharing your read. It was so nice that you had it handy so you could kind of show it to the people watching the video, which is super cool. If I asked your high school friends what they thought you'd be doing today, what would they say?
So when I was in high school, I was very, very adamant that I was going to be an emergency room doctor. Like that was my thing. I'm very interested in emergency medicine. I love the human body and the amazing things that it can do in response to trauma to try to keep us alive. And so I was that geek in high school that was taking like all the science classes and everything offered and talking to my friends about how I was going to be this doctor. And then I got to college and I discovered psychology and I discovered counseling and I was like, oh, I actually really like this too. It's kind of a funny story. So I did my bachelor's in psychology and I eventually went back and got my master's in education and I was a school counselor at the beginning of my career. And I liked it well enough. But I always felt like there was something missing in my career that I just wasn't getting. And I ended up becoming an EMT and volunteering with a local ambulance association on their ambulance. And I was just like, yes, this was what I was missing. It's the emergency medicine piece. Like I got to reconnect with that. So that was working for a while where I was working with in the schools, and then I eventually worked with children and family and counseling settings. And when I moved to Iowa and I started doing crisis counseling, it ended up being the beautiful blend of both things. Of I get to do the counseling aspect that I love and helping people work through tough situations, but I get that emergency crisis response piece of it too, of like, oh, with mobile crisis, I'm going out to where you are and I'm going to meet you where you're at and we're going to work through this together. So that's actually been a really cool kind of pathway.
All right. Very, very cool. It's nice to see how those things kind of have blended together. You know, your love for, you know, in the background, talking about being an ER doctor and now really being in love with crisis counseling and stuff. You can see that, you know, a lot of the parallels, and so many of the theories now that we use are brain and body based, and so that background and physiology is very helpful. So,
Yeah.
what is the hardest thing you have ever done?
Besides moving to Amsterdam. um, I think it was leaving the schools. So like I said, I started my career as a school counselor, and I started down that route because I am very passionate about mental health, particularly for young people who maybe are starting to experience those, first sort of episodes of depression or bipolar disorder or other situations that arise typically in adolescence and early adulthood. And so I was like, okay, this is perfect. I'll be a school counselor. I can be that caring, supportive adult that is there for them when these things start to emerge. And I recognized working in the schools that there's a lot more that goes into school counseling than actually counseling. There's a lot of other aspects to the job that are not counseling. And I had to make this decision of like, I've spent this time and this money becoming a school counselor, getting my master's, getting my licensure as a school counselor, starting a career, building up this knowledge base about this particular field, but I'm also not loving it 100%. And I finally made the decision of like, no, the reason that I got into this is because I want to help people that are struggling with their mental health. This isn't for me. This isn't the way that I want to do it. It's not aligning with my values. And so I made the decision to leave working in the schools and going into working at nonprofits, which was a very hard decision, but probably the best decision I've ever made.
Okay, that's that sounds like that would definitely be an internal challenge. You could see the struggles there with your passions and leaving something that you're passionate about. Certainly. What's the best purchase you've ever made?
My cats. This is gonna sound weird. I am a huge believer in the power of animals to impact our mental health in positive ways. Whether that's animal assisted therapy to just being a pet owner. My cats have definitely been that source of strength for me when things have gotten tough. Those times where I've been like, I just want to quit my job and pack up and run away without a plan. Um, I've like, it's really helped me to have them and to stop and be like, no, I gotta feed my cats and I gotta make sure I've got money for vet bills and all these things. So they've definitely helped ground me. And I mean, just also bringing so much joy to my life. I complain about them, but they're super cute and I love to play with them. And so, yeah.
Okay, super cool. Okay, as a child, did anyone close to you ever die or leave you? And how would you describe that loss?
My best friend died when we were still teenagers. He had he had this really awful car, like you do when you're a teenager, and it wasn't running right. So he had pulled over to the side of the road to check on what was going on, and there was a gal who was texting and driving, and she looked down at her phone and didn't see him, and she hit him. So he died. Um, I think we talk about grief in stages and how it's not linear. And that's totally true. Like when it first happened, I think I went right into almost into crisis mode of like, okay, I need to check on all of our friends and I need to make sure everybody's okay. Um, I didn't have a time to kind of mourn for myself right away because I was worried about others. And then the actual grief didn't hit until months later. Um, and it's interesting looking back on it now because I could see all those stages of grief that we talk about. The anger at the girl and um, the bargaining, just about everything. But at the time, it just felt super overwhelming. Um, so that's something that I kind of keep in mind too when I'm working with people, especially because I also work with a lot of suicide loss survivors. It's just that even though on the outside I can see that they're in these stages of grief, to them it feels like total chaos.
Mm, mm.
Um, and yeah, being able to kind of draw on my own experience with that kind of loss has been helpful.
Well, I'm very sorry for your loss, and appreciate your openness to discuss it, and certainly that's um, a great. It speaks to this, the brave, when we talk about brave faces and brave spaces and these kinds of things. I think it takes a lot of bravery, to be vulnerable enough to talk about that, but it's also so helpful for people who have, been through losses, and is what you have seen, and able to help other people through their losses because of what you've learned internally about your own. Um, I want to thank you for your time today. It's been enjoyable, educational, and inspirational. All those things. I've just enjoyed sitting with you and learning about your decisions and the culture in which you currently live and how it's impacted you. I just appreciate your openness to discuss those things.
Yeah, of course. It was wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Brown.
All right, I'm going to stop the recording now so then I can ask the real questions. So.
That's good.